So, Chapter 13 covers the presidency, so the executive branch of the federal government. And to get started, most importantly, defining some of the important powers of the President of the United States. So, expressed powers would be those that were very specifically granted in the Constitution to both Congress, which is in Article 1, and to the President, which Article 2. So then you have, however, in the presidency specifically, delegated powers, which these are constitutional powers that are assigned to one branch of government that are exercised by another. Most commonly, powers that were granted to Congress, but they are given to another, and it's usually with express written permission, which the best example of this would be President Lyndon Johnson and his powers granted in the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. This was all relative to his war-making powers in Vietnam. Then you have inherent powers, which this is powers claimed by a president that are not expressed in the Constitution but are inferred from it. And essentially, a president does these things, no one challenges it, and then it becomes an accepted power of the presidency. So a good example of this is the suspension of habeas corpus during the Civil War by President Abraham Lincoln. The power to do this is mentioned in Article 1, which Article 1 outlines the powers of Congress. But it is utilized by presidents, whose powers are only described in Article 2. So this is a very controversial thing among constitutional scholars, is did Lincoln even have the power to do what he did during the Civil War? So you can see here Lyndon Johnson pinning a medal on an 82nd Airborne soldier during the Vietnam conflict. So his delegated powers over the war in Vietnam, given the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution of Congress, and then this meme, this joke about how President Lincoln suspended habeas corpus, but the suspension clause is actually in Article 1, so that would be an inherent power. So what are the expressed powers? Those that were actually very specifically given to the president by the Constitution. First, you have military powers, such as being commander-in-chief of all the United States military forces, and judicial powers, granting reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except for the cases of impeachment. Also, the appointment of federal judges. So when there's a vacancy on a federal court, or maybe even the Supreme Court, it is up to the power of the president to fill that seat. Diplomatic powers, okay? Treaties, but with this term, the advice and consent of the Senate. So the Senate needs to approve of the treaties that are negotiated by the executive branch. Again, ambassadors, public ministers, so ambassadors to foreign countries, public ministers is where presidential cabinet members fall under that category. Again, they need to be approved by the Senate, but appointed by the president. Executive powers, executed, faithfully executed. This is probably the thing most pointed out to like elementary students, is that what is the power of the executive branch? It is to enforce the laws. And then, of course, the power of chief... Oops, I kind of crossed that out on accident. The chief of state, this is where every year you have the State of the Union address. What is the condition of the nation? And that is given by the president. So it's his job as chief of state to keep the public informed. And the role in the legislative process that includes the veto power. So these are all expressed powers, very specifically outlined in the Constitution in Article 2. So you have some various State of the Union addresses being referenced here. President Bush, in the thick of the war on terror and the war in Iraq, giving his State of the Union with this political cartoon of things are not looking good, yet he's going to paint a rosy picture. And then a joke here, President Obama was often accused of abusing his executive order powers. So this is him giving his State of the Union, and he's saying the State of the Union is perfect by executive order. And another joke here of President Obama shaking down the rich for more funding for the federal government via higher taxes on the rich. Executive privilege. So this is the claim that confidential communications between a president and their close advisors should not be revealed without the consent of the president. So during the Watergate scandal, President Richard Nixon, depicted here in his resignation address to the country, he tried to hide his involvement by invoking executive privilege, and in the Supreme Court case U.S. v. Nixon, it was declared by the Supreme Court that he was not able to do that. Another example of this, one you may not have heard of, Operation Fast and Furious. This was an Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms operation in which essentially firearms were knowingly sold to Mexican drug cartels, and the ATF was then going to keep track of what happened with those weapons that had been knowingly sold, and it ended up in the death of a Border Patrol agent by the name of Brian Terry. And in this firestorm, I guess, that erupted after this, President Obama used executive privilege to hide some of the communications that had gone on between he and his Attorney General Eric Holder as this scandal unfolded. And so there's not a lot that the public really knows about this scandal, because this was an example of a successful use of executive privilege to keep communications private. Now, executive orders. A couple of the most famous were actually issued by President Roosevelt during the Great Depression and World War II. So this one required you to turn in all of your gold and gold certificates and gold coin to the Federal Reserve. And this one here is his executive order creating Japanese internment camps during World War II. These are rules and regulations that are put out by the president, but they have the effect and formal status of legislation. Many people, including myself, think that executive orders in most cases are unconstitutional because it is the president seizing legislative powers. The presidential cabinet was created by George Washington mainly just because he thought it was a good idea to have a group of people advising him, because he knew the powers of the presidency were entirely too complex, entirely too intimidating for him to handle single-handedly, all on his own. So his first ever cabinet was Secretary of War Henry Knox, Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, and Attorney General Edmund Randolph. And every president since has had a cabinet of advisors because they saw what a great idea it was of Washington's, how well it worked for him, and it has been done by every president since. The National Security Council is very specifically a presidential foreign policy advisory council. So the president and vice president, of course, but also the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and other officials invited by the president. Okay, so what you see here is at the time, and I do not recall his name, forgive me, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of the military. Um, Here is Secretary of Defense at the time, Bob Gates, um, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, President Obama, Vice President Biden, and this is in the thick of the um, raid on the compound that was hiding Osama bin Laden. You can see other people in this room that had been invited by the president. A couple that I happen to know by name, a man, James Clapper, another man, John Brennan. These are both intelligence officials. I believe John Brennan was director of the CIA at the time. Long story short, these are all people that are integral to national security and certainly were integral to the raid on bin Laden's compound. And so the National Security Council is, as far as military powers, Homeland Security is concerned, the National Security Council is all the most important advisors of the president when it's concerning foreign relations, in particular the military. And you have the bureaucracy. Okay, this is the cabinet of advisors on steroids. So all of the cabinet positions often have people who work under each of those cabinet positions. In particular, you have a White House staff. So they might not be assigned to a particular cabinet position, but may work within the White House for the president all the time. And oftentimes the people who make up the White House staff are given the title Special Assistant to the President. And you can see here President Obama meeting his White House staff for a formal picture. And you can see just how large of a staff he had in the White House. There's a lot going on in the White House on a day-to-day basis, and so you can see it takes a lot of people to perform all those duties and all those responsibilities. You can imagine how intimidated President Washington was to lead him to have the first ever presidential cabinet. Well, how much more intimidating it must be to a modern president, and therefore would explain why there's probably year after year, more and more and more people working in the bureaucracy in general under the cabinet of advisors, but also the White House staff within the White House as well. This concludes the Chapter 13 lecture. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out, and I will see you in class.